So we're really excited to be here, and I'm really thrilled to have this particular panel because I think, as you'll see, there's a real diversity of backgrounds and professional experience that I think will make for an interesting conversation that will both raise and answer questions for the audience. I'd like to start by just having each of the panelists take a moment or two to describe what their role is and how it relates to the topic of ethical considerations in designing for financial behavior change. So start with Carly, and then after that, I'm not going to do any more round robin. We're going to have more of a conversation.
So I'm Carly França. I've been leading design specifically on something called the Student Debt Tool within the Student Debt Initiative of Fidelity Investments. This is applicable. I know we mentioned earlier student debt being one of the ways to target millennials, but especially as we begin to try and target millennials in ethical ways, we want to help them. So I've been very embedded in this the last 3.5 years.
Excellent. And I'm Skyler Place. I run the behavioral science team at Cogito. We're an augmented intelligence tech company here in Boston. And we do a lot of work nudging people's behavior during phone calls. And there's a lot of really important ethics when you're applying big data to understand outcomes and making sure that the behaviors that you are motivating people to do are going to help the widest cross-section of the population and aren't targeting or accidentally biasing particular segments or particular individuals as you're recommending behavior change.
Hey, so I'm Danielle Hartigan. I'm at Bentley University, and I'm a social psychologist, and I study human interaction, particularly around nonverbal behaviors and how we make perceptions of other people in interactions. And so I think, one of the things we look at is, AI might tell us something about what to say, but also thinking about how we say that and making sure that we bring in kind of the human element of those kinds of interactions.
So I'm at Rutledge. I'm an economist at Boston College. I teach in the econ department. I'm also a fellow at the Center for Retirement Research. So my work is in retirement and disability. I'm hoping to bring the sort of the 10,000-foot view to this panel here today, and also to watch my nonverbal behavior.
I'm paying attention.
Yeah, and actually that mention of the 10,000-foot view is a great place to start, because one of the tensions that I see in my work all the time around thinking ethically is how do we balance that 10,000-foot view of how people do behave and maybe how they should behave, what we think is the right thing for them to do, with the way that they actually navigate the real world, make decisions, choose to use a product, a service, or not. So does anyone care to start with how you approach that tension?
Well, can I start with just the understanding that I think we have some difficulties even saying what they should be doing, really. There's not one-size-fits-all plan for everybody, of course, but I think we all do have some common goals. I mean, I think everybody wants to be sure that they're not eating cat food in retirement, for instance. I think there's a lot of people that are very worried about student debt, and I know we talked about that already offline. And so even the should part, I think, is going to be tough. If you're trying to nudge people towards what they should be doing, I think then we're even thinking about, like, they probably aren't saving enough, because hardly anybody actually does. They probably aren't getting the right mix of sort of liquid savings, the stuff that you can actually use on the short term versus the stuff that you're locking away so that you are not tempted to use it over the longer term. It's a tough balance to achieve, and it's not even clear to us exactly where that balance should be.
I can just say in designing the student debt tool, everyone who has student debt, there's three main things that they're going to be after. They're either going to want to pay that off sooner, they're going to want to spend less over time, or they simply cannot afford their monthly payment as it is right now. And the number of times I've gotten into a meeting and someone's like, why don't we just tell them what to do? And the truth is, we're Fidelity Investments. We're primarily focused on retirement. We don't have a full financial picture already for these people coming in with just student debt. So it'd be very short-sighted of us to say, do this. And then on top of that, not just looking at the numbers, student debt is often kind of people's first foray into the financial world. But we have to also acknowledge, we understand that, yes, you should pay more towards your student debt, but also that you don't want to and you can't. And we're going to acknowledge that and show you the both financial and emotional decision that you're making and let you make that decision for yourself.
Carly brings up an interesting point, and I think maybe I can ask a question of those of you who actually talk to people. I'm an economist, I don't talk to people. Do you get the impression that people just kind of want to be told what to do? I mean, a lot of the decisions that they have to make are so complicated, Do they ever just sort of throw up their hands and say, just tell me what to do and I'll do it? Do you have that sort of
think
reaction from them much?
It's half and half in my experience, and if they start one way, they'll end the other. I think, especially with millennials and specifically in student debt, I am these people. We are very distrustful of specifically financial services organizations and are getting hit constantly with offers and things that seem too good to be true. So yeah, tell me what to do, but then also let me feel like I'm making that decision and make that choice. So taking everything away and saying, do this, no thank you.
So I think we can learn a lot, and I'm glad you brought up kind of the trust element here, because we can learn a lot from other contexts. So a lot of my work is in patient-provider communication and patient-provider interactions. And we know there that what we should do, and what the evidence says is best for patient care, is what's called shared decision-making. And a lot of people think that means, okay, so now the patient makes all the decisions. Well, the patient obviously knows a lot about them and their health. You might know a lot about you and your finances, but you don't know what the doctor knows, which is all the medical expertise, or the financial expertise in this case. So it's this fine balance, and kind of that 10,000-foot view is that 9 out of 10 patients really want shared decision making, especially millennials. They're more empowered to make their own choices. We see a lot with older patients, for example, that they're saying, I'm not used to this. I want my doctor just to tell me what to do. But it turns out if they do that, if the doctor does that, that they don't necessarily engage with or adhere to the recommendations as strongly. So there still has to be kind of a balance between, you might direct, you might nudge, you might kind of build trust so that they listen to your recommendations, but there still has to be buy-in from the consumer or the patient.
And we find the exact same thing in our situation, which is call center agents talking to customers of financial service organizations, where that other party is not a doctor, but an artificial intelligent coach. And we describe it as a coach. The persona is a coach very much because of this need for shared decision making and shared trust, which comes out of a lot of the great work Danielle has done. Where we want the agent on the call, we want the human in the loop to be making the decision, and that we're providing them we're augmenting their decision-making process, but we're not making those decisions for them.
So how do you make people want to make the right choice, or do you?
To shock them, right? That's the standard psychology answer.
Somebody made a point on an earlier panel today about, I should preface this by saying I'm kind of a financial literacy skeptic. I think it's really hard to get people to really retain the information that they're getting from financial literacy classes or from the workshops that they might have to do, or even just like the tools that sometimes are put in front of them right before they sign a mortgage or sign college loans. But somebody made the point that you kind of have to get people to experience things to get them to learn it. And you want that opportunity to get people more experience in general. And so maybe actually letting them make the mistakes sometimes is actually a useful thing, as long as it's not too costly. Obviously, if you lose your shirt, that's not so bad. But if you lose your house, that's something that could really have some long-lasting impacts, and that's not the kind of experience we want them to have.
I think another interesting component of that is the timing of when you offer advice and when you offer suggestions, and in giving information to people when they have the opportunity to process it, where they're not overwhelmed, but the information is still actionable. So in our world, that means providing guidance in the moment while the call is happening in a way that is consumable, so we don't overwhelm them. But if we tell them after the call is over, oh, you should have done X, Y, Z, it's not as actionable for them to be able to learn from that and then change their behavior on a go-forward basis.
I think also the role of motivation is really complicated, and a lot more complicated than we assume. So we assume if somebody's motivated to, have better conversations, that automatically they're going to be able to do that. They're going to pay more attention. They're going to try harder. But research from social psychology and some of the work that I've done has shown that in reality, there's some aspects of communication, particularly the nonverbal or the more subconscious elements, that you can't really control on your own. So tools, resources, in real time might help you. But I think we assume just if we, give people incentives, pay them $20 more to have a better call, that they're going to do that, and that doesn't necessarily work that way.
Yeah, part of what I'm hearing, and I'm imposing a little bit of my own experience on this too, is there's a balance between getting somebody to do something right now. So maybe I give you $20 and you sign up for the credit card or the loan payment program, but then that long-term behavior change takes some different fuel.
Yeah, there's a topic, I know other people on this panel know more about it than I do, but around motivation and engagement. and what are the levers that you can pull that won't just allow someone to make a decision in the moment, like signing up for the credit card with a $20 incentive, but being willing to enroll in a program where they have to put in effort over a longer time period. And how do you build that rapport, that engagement, and that willingness to change early in the relationship or the interaction, which gets back to that trustworthiness we heard about earlier, so that individuals are then willing to put the time and the effort in over a longer time scale to drive towards that behavior change, which is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, we have a question that I'm not going to get to quite yet. I have a question I want to add to lead in, but we're getting the question is around nudging and behavioral economics, which is to be expected because it's obviously relevant here. And I'm interested in the perspectives from all of you on the panel. To what extent is this paternalistic libertarian approach where we know what is good for somebody and we design a situation to increase the likelihood that they do that good thing? To what extent is that the right way to approach designing for financial services, or to what extent should we let people have the failure? Or where is the line? Very easy question.
I'll just say, in my experience in talking to these users, I have almost a visceral reaction to no, we're not going to tell people what to do. We don't know them. We don't know enough about them. If we get to a point that we do, I'm willing to rehab this conversation. But I think right now what I know and what Fidelity knows about the particular group I've been focused on, we don't know. We don't know, and we can't be inserting ourselves and telling people what to do. We can give them options. We can give them all of the tools. We can empower them. And then we got to walk away and let it happen, to your point. And maybe they'll learn a lesson that will be painful, but they'll learn the lesson.
Yeah, it does seem like avoiding the appearance of heavy-handedness, I think, is important. And like Skyler was saying, I think you need to have buy-in. For a decision to really have some teeth, for them to stick with it. I think maybe one thing that Danielle's probably seen with the provider-patient relationship is the doctor can only help you as much as you really want to be helped. You have to still comply with whatever the doctor's wanting you to do. I'm sure financial advisors get this too. We've told you should probably concentrate on paying down your credit cards before you worry about your student debt, but you're still going to have that student debt cloud hanging over your head. So it's really hard to get them to do that sort of thing when they haven't fully bought in. Now I'm a skeptic about financial literacy, but I think I really do feel like educating the person about this specific decision is something that could be really effective, and that's the only way you're going to get that buy-in is if they understand why they're doing it.
Does that connect back to Skyler's point about, I was thinking the phrase teachable moment, but finding the right time to make the suggestion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting for some situations is that the nudges may actually be less heavy-handed than other approaches that are currently in place. So we do a lot of work with call centers where the agents the words they're saying are very, very heavily scripted. And the idea of going off script is not always the best practice that the organization wants those individuals to do. And what we found is empowering individuals with nudges actually gives them the flexibility and the autonomy to make decisions that they didn't have prior. So even though the system may be providing very tactical, pointed recommendations, the ability to say, I want to follow this one and not that one, is a freedom that these individuals didn't have prior.
That's actually a great lead into the first audience question that we have, which is, are Richard Thaler's 3 nudge rules, which are transparency, easy opt-out, and a genuine belief that whatever you're nudging is for the nudgee's benefit, practical?
Interesting. I think so. I work in a world of big data where the nudges that we are recommending are driven from machine learning algorithms from millions of calls. And oftentimes the patterns behind that are not transparent to the people who designed them, let alone an individual in a moment while making a phone call. So I think it's an interesting philosophy. I would struggle to imagine every situation where it's possible, particularly on the transparency side. The rationale for why I am telling you to do this, if you need to do something in a time limited or in a limited fashion, whether it's time or another resource that you are limited by. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that makes sense definitely in some contexts, but I agree especially with the transparency point that sometimes when you bring these things to conscious awareness, they can either have the reverse effect, So sometimes if you let somebody know that you're trying to nudge them in a certain direction, they can actually, I mean, we've seen
Like
this
that.
maybe politically when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody that doesn't necessarily agree with you. The second you kind of get them down a path where maybe they're going to agree with you, they say, whoa, 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 and step back and go completely 180 the other direction. So, you know, I don't know that maybe those are kind of good principles to start with, to think about, or at least consider the ethical implications of, but I don't know that they're necessarily necessary.
I think it's interesting that I think I slightly disagree in which of the three of those goals is the hardest to achieve. I actually think the easy opt-out part is hard, and I think Thaler on his Twitter feed is actually really great about documenting real-life cases of sludges, like sort of the reverse of the nudge, where somebody has deliberately made something hard to do. I think sometimes it's not even deliberate. I think a lot of the administrative hassle of signing up for a 401k, signing up for an HSA or some sort of other health plan, just are by their nature difficult. And so it'd be difficult to sign up and opt out. I mean, it's difficult to opt in, you know, if you know, all that paperwork you got to do, and that's why a lot of people just don't do it. When the default is that you're signed up and then you have to opt out, that part's going to be difficult too, just by its nature, right? Unless you can really streamline that sort of experience, and I think maybe some of the design folks in the room could speak to that, that part I feel like is going to be even harder in some ways than the transparency part.
I'll just add, just on a executionary, as far as the transparency thing goes, I know within the debt tool, in two places, because we kept hearing over and over again this distrust, we say right away on the landing page, why does Fidelity care about this? What are we doing? Well, we care because you're not investing in your retirement, and we want to help you. And then on any of our options pages, there's a section at the bottom that says, what's the catch? Like, what's in it for them? And that has, I mean, it's just one specific use case, but I think it depends on the demographic, whether or not you can be transparent, how complicated.
Yeah,
Since Carly brought it up, I have to talk a little bit about the research I've done. I don't want to spend the whole time doing that, obviously. But we did a study recently with some data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. People that were surveyed, they're in their early 30s now. And so basically we're looking to see, among the people who had student debt, did it seem like it was getting in the way of retirement saving? And we found some really surprising results. I think results we had to sort of torture to make sure that they were correct. Basically, with college graduates, having student debt didn't really affect whether you were participating in a 401k, just whether you were participating or not. And we think a lot of that is because of the strength of defaults. You know, a lot of people are defaulted into a plan now, and so they may be in, maybe they're just not saving much more than the default rate. Where we were really seeing a difference was among people with student debt, they had saved about half as much by the time they got to age 30. The thing that was really interesting about that, though, was that among people with student debt, it didn't matter whether you had a small amount of debt or a large amount of debt, just having some student debt, basically, they were all about the same in terms of how much they accumulated by age 30. So I think we interpret that sort of from a behavioral perspective, like the fact that you have student debt matters much more than what you can actually sort of go to your budget and figure out what you can afford to save. Just like people are focused on that student debt rather than the much longer term things, even though I think they have every incentive to pay that student debt down slowly, especially with the tax incentives and that sort of thing. But they're not getting that message, I think. And so any way in which, what's ironic about that is that a lot of the ways that we talk about maybe lightening the load of student debt is income-based repayment, you know, where you would only pay up to some percentage of your salary. And if that ends up making it longer that you have your student debt, our results suggest that that actually might be really bad for their retirement saving. That's going to delay the start of their starting their savings. And then the talk we had this morning about what was the point I was going to make? I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting, though, that the debt itself has a psychological weight that is not related to the magnitude of the debt itself.
Yeah, it's holding you back, right? You buy a house, you buy a car, you're looking forward. Your debt's or your education's just following you, and you're like, I'm still paying for my brain.
That's a good point, though. The time horizon is different.
If you put it as paying for their brain, maybe they feel a little bit better about it. I don't know.
You can't repo someone's brain.
Yeah, I have a really good friend from grad school who makes that point in song. So there's a couple of really difficult questions here, but I do want to pose them. So this one is, how should organizations be held accountable, if at all, when nudges end up not being in the nudgee's best interest? And I'll actually give you, because there's a question that I see is related here, is why don't financial institutions nudge before the overdraft fee hits the customer account? And I have my cynical answer for that at the ready, and I think it does relate to the accountability question.
Well, I think your cynical answer is probably the right one, but I did appreciate that point from an earlier panel today. There was basically saying that $25 isn't necessarily worth it to the bank. If that's going to sort of mess up the relationship with that client or mess up their ability to sort of not fall behind in their finances. And so it's short-sighted thinking that they nonetheless probably do sometimes, but to focus on sort of those little gains. And so that's really good news. I think that means that the financial services companies, the credit card companies and the student debt providers and all that have an incentive to get us actually to be doing the right thing for ourselves. And that means that all of the incentives are aligned. That's great news. Like, that's win-win for everyone.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about sort of the customer lifetime value aspect of it, which is, if you have nudges that aren't working in the individual's favor, are you losing a customer because of it? And in our customers making decisions to stay or leave an organization based on a very few set of moments. And there's some interesting work by McKinsey who describes these as the moments of truth, where you may be with one credit card for 10 years, but all of a sudden you have your first instance of losing the card abroad, and the ability of them to get you that card quickly determines, do you stay with that company or do you switch to the competitor? And it wasn't until you had that moment that it even occurred to you to switch. And it'd be interesting to look at I don't have the data, it'll be interesting to look at the data for those kinds of nudges in seeing when are nudges moments of truth for consumers or for individuals, and are those moments that you really do want to get correct. So you may really want to offer a nudge on reminding people before the overdraft fee comes through, if that is a moment where you otherwise would have someone switch from Bank of America to Fidelity.
So if I can paraphrase, then it sounds like those moments of truth, that customer loyalty, customer longevity, they are the accountability. All right, so this is one that I know we've already talked a little bit about offline, but it came through and it's actually the highest voted question right now. And it's when we think about things such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, all these algorithm-driven technologies that are seemingly the future of where financial services are going. How do we safeguard against unintentional biases being built into these technologies and tools?
I'm happy to start with that one. I get that question a lot. So I think one of the core tenets are that machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence today are still entirely made by people. And people, no matter who they are, have their own biases, their own unconscious perspectives on the world. And you have to acknowledge that when you're designing technology and when you are designing the teams who are going to be designing your technology. So if you have a team of machine learning scientists who are all 25-year-old white males or who are all 50-year-old African-American females, you're going to have biases in either situation. So a lot of it is to first recognize that and acknowledge it, and acknowledge that if you go at it from a pure data perspective, you are always going to have biases. They are a part of who we are as people. And you have to proactively develop standards for your hiring on your teams and then standards for designing those algorithms to be able to have any chance of creating a system that can recognize those biases and then combat or adjust for them.
I can be the optimist for a rare moment. I think these interesting stories you hear about how basically the machine learning or the AI has replicated our own biases, I think may be an opportunity for us to sort of recognize those biases in ourselves. I actually sent this story to Amy after we had our pre-call about this group that found when they tried to basically automate a lot of the analysis of resumes, ended up finding that the two things that were most highly correlated with the applicant actually getting the job is whether their name was something like Travis and whether they played high school lacrosse. And so there's clearly a lot of socioeconomics sort of coming through with that kind of finding, but it allows us to be introspective about why are we getting these kinds of results. You know, that's an opportunity for us to sort of force a change in our prioritizations. You know, it's a change in how we really sort of react to the world, and maybe AI can see or sort of be a path towards us being better humans too. I don't know. Of course, it could also destroy us, so we'll see.
But I think I'll make a plug kind of for, as Skyler said, kind of having a behavioral science expert on the team. I mean, as social psychologists, they've been studying this for years, and although, you know, artificial intelligence is relatively new, we've been using data to explore these kinds of biases for a long time. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, these systems might be very rational, and human beings are not very rational, right? We all know we don't make financial decisions always with the best rational interest. And so kind of appreciating the role of emotions and bias in addition is important.
I would just add one related story is thinking about the fact that prevalence and valence are not the same, which means when you're looking at big data sets, the things that are happening most often in those data sets are not always the behaviors that you want to coach to or to recommend to. So we did a really interesting study with one of our large customers where they wanted us to analyze the behavior of their best speaking agents and then train the system to basically mimic that behavior so that all their agents would behave like the best agents. And it turns out their best agents are still human, and while they are good most of the time, there are some situations where they are systematically behaving in a way that you wouldn't want. So, for example, male agents interrupting female customers when they're asking questions was an interruption pattern that we saw more often in some subsets of the data. And that was a pattern that when we brought the data to the behavioral scientists and did a sort of bias review before we spit the algorithm out, this was not a best practice behavior that we wanted to push out across the entire organization, right? And it's sort of a trivial example, but it's really important that we have so much power now with data, but we have to apply the human perspective on top of that, or else we'll end up in these situations that are so easy to avoid and so simple to think about on the surface that the data may otherwise send us towards, because of the fact that when you aggregate people, the aggregation of the whole is not always the sum that you're looking for, right? It's not always the best behavior.
So along those lines, do you feel, by the way, I think the name was Trevor, not Travis. That makes a little bit more sense. So along those lines, do you feel like bots are going to get to the point where they're a little bit too perfect? You know, where it's like kind of an uncanny valley of communications where you actually kind of, you want a little bit of imperfection as sort of part of humanity. And if a bot is sort of just a little bit too perfect, then that's going to make a customer kind of uncomfortable, or somebody who's interacting with that bot?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I think the other really interesting research around this is that people want to know if they're talking to a bot. Yep. So a bot that is almost human-like, that is not identified as a bot, is actually one of the worst customer service experiences you can do, because individuals feel like they've been lied to, they've been misled. That trustworthiness that is so hard to create and preserve in a relationship between an individual and an organization, you can break very easily. So humans want imperfection, but they also want honesty. And they rather talk to a bot that is going to answer a simple question like, what is my balance, than talk to a bot who is masquerading as a human who is apologetic for their balance being lower than they expected.
So I have an interest actually in what generates people's trust in algorithms and bots and those sorts of things. And one of the findings that is consistently coming out now in the psychological literature is that people trust an algorithm more when they can open the black box and tinker with it themselves, even if they know that that means their results will be worse. So if I go in and I do my 401k investment settings on my own, chances are I will have a lower return than if I had just left it as is, but I'm going to feel better about it. Where do you think the limits are of, giving people that control so that they feel the trust and the positive emotion, but, not, or do we just let them take that to the extreme and potentially, crash the plane into the ground, or do we try to protect them to some extent?
Again, I think we can go a little bit to medicine to kind of, right? I mean, you want to have control and understand, but at the same time, we see even the most engaged, activated, empowered patients still want that maybe could prescribe their own drugs. And, we think about virtual visits and AI in healthcare. They still want that human connection with, for lack of a better word, an authority in medicine to kind of guide them and help them. So I'm a little skeptical about things that say, that putting all the control with the consumer is a good thing. We've also seen some interesting things, so I'll give you a quick anecdote around kind of a traditional model of medicine. We've been patients, be empowered, take control, do more for your health. And we've seen in urgent care that backfiring a little bit. So when you talk to providers in urgent care, one of their biggest challenges is patients that come in the door and say, already been online, I know what I have, give me the antibiotic and send me on my way quickly, okay? And it could be wrong, and it could be against the evidence, and what we're seeing in urgent care is lots of overprescription of antibiotics, for example, which is really dangerous, not only for the patient, but the whole society at large. Yeah. So, too much control can kind of backfire. So again, it's kind of that, where's that line? I don't know, but there's one there.
Yeah, and I think the line also exists. I work with client organizations since I work for a consultancy, protecting the reputation of your product and your service as well. Like, why would you invest with me if your investments are going to tank? I mean, of course, it's your fault they tanked, but...
But they're not going to think of that at the end of the day.
So this is an interesting question. I don't totally know the answer to this, so apologies for throwing you all this curveball. But what do you think about Apple and other companies constantly listening to our conversations in order to target their advertisements and their services? Where does that hit for you in an ethical sense?
Right now.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think we're mic'd.
Well, they're advertising to us anyway. So just to play devil's advocate, I obviously don't want them listening on my calls, but if they're going to advertise this to us anyway, it might as well be helpful advertisement, right? But I don't know, maybe this is a generational thing. Maybe we'll get used to the fact that we don't have privacy. I'm not sure that's good news, but we're going to kind of have to get used to it because it's not going away. Like, if anything, it's only going to get worse, right? And we just have to hope that it's not being used for evil. If it's selling us, that's probably not evil. But if there's more, then that's when we start to worry. I don't know where that line is, though.
Yeah, I think from a technology perspective, I think a little bit of the war has already been lost, or the value has already been created, depending on how you look at it. So my wife and I were joking about how we didn't want to put an Amazon Echo in our bedroom, because we don't want Amazon listening. And I was saying, I have a Google phone on my night table. You have an Apple phone on your night table. They're already all listening all the time. We've already,
Let Amazon go.
We've already lost 2 of the 3 biggest tech companies. Already have all of our data. What's another one? And I think that's a little bit of whether it's a consumer education question or privacy advocacy. Most of us are carrying smartphones, and whether or not they're recording your voice all the time, they're absolutely recording your GPS location. And from technology being able to predict and understand people, your GPS is as valuable or as predictive as your voice for a whole variety of outcomes, whether it's financial decisions, healthcare, or advertising. And there are situations where there are companies using that data for good. There's unbelievable research being able to use that kind of data to predict episodes of depression and bipolar. That same data set could be used by a big tech company to figure out if your advertising should be X or Y. So I think as a society, we've come to accept the value of a smartphone. And I think there's a dark side to it as well. Who has our data and what is it being used for? But the data itself is inherently valuable. And valuable not just for advertising dollars, but to improve a whole other slew of human conditions and human outcomes. And I think we have to weigh a little bit the balance of which organizations we want to give that data to, and I think more importantly, when do we get to make that decision, right? When have we already, as I said, lost the war, where Amazon or Google or Facebook or others are going to have that data sort of already, even if you never have an Echo in your house, because your friend will come over and visit with their smartphone in their pocket, and there's that conversation, right?
Yeah, I am one of the people, I also got rid of the Amazon Echo in my house, but similar thing. Everyone else has our data. And I was outraged when I discovered they were tracking my GPS to the extent they are, but then my running tracking app didn't work, and I thought, oh, Google Maps knows where I was. So I just used it. This I think is kind of a fun counterfactual question, but what are the least ethical things that tech can do, and how do we prevent that?
Torture torture? Well, how big are we thinking here?
So the
which
person
episode of Black
actually
Mirror?
gave some examples. AI-powered natural language processing, subliminal messages, hypnosis. Those were suggestions in the question.
In general, just making us lose our trust a little bit, I think, and maybe trust in each other even. You know, I can't remember the name of that movie, but it was the one about East Germany where everybody's sort of listening to their neighbors and sort of, sorry, what was it? The lives of others, right? You know, where you're sort of, it's just a degradation of society in a way that's sort of hard to like pinpoint as happening at any particular time. But just because you lose that trust, it sort of just goes down that slippery slope. And we might get that with the technology. That's definitely not the optimism I was expressing before.
I worry a little bit about the loss of kind of the humanity, and I think you had a talk about this earlier, but you know, if you're only talking to bots when you call customer service, or if you only have virtual visits and never actually see a real doctor, I mean, we know a lot about the power of touch, for example, and you know, the kind of human interaction and what that does to build trust and build, you know, rapport between two people or between a customer and an organization even. So, I think it's great in a sense when it augments that, but not necessarily replacing that all the time.
And along those lines, I think social isolation is something we worry about, especially with elders now, but I think that's the kind of thing we're all falling victim to, and technology is definitely making our worst behavior, or our worst impulses easier to do. It's easier to feel like you're not being antisocial if you're also tweeting about how shy you are, right?
It just, I don't have anything to say. It all scares me.
Well, with that, we're actually out of time. So I want to thank the panel. They're incredible, smart, insightful people, and I'm so glad they were all able to join today. And all of you for your questions. These were really great questions, and I think we'll probably never answer some of them, but I'm glad that we had the chance to talk through them.